My guest today is Lance Zierlein from the NFL Network. Lance has been in the NFL space for decades now, starting out with his own sports publication, moving to radio, and eventually to the NFL Network, covering the draft with over 500 prospect evals every year. Lance was an interesting interview. We talked about many things, covering all topics in the NFL. Of course, we ended up with the Commanders. I hope you enjoyed this. If you do, please make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel, like it, leave us a couple of comments so we know what you thought. At any rate, here is my conversation with Lance Zierlein. All right, welcome, Lance, to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How you doing, Big Doug?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's we've had a little dueling schedules the last couple of months, but I really appreciate you taking some time out to do this with me today. Lance, your way to the NFL Network, interesting one. I'm going to read this from what I wrote so I don't get it wrong. You started out by doing the Pigskin Sports, which led to radio spots promoting the paper, I guess, to a full-time gig. Then a fallout with ownership of the radio station where the full-time gig was, where you had a popular show, which led to you creating your own station.
Well, it wasn't me. I kind of my radio co-host from it's a flagship station of the Texans. He went and started a locally owned and operated station, and so I ended up joining him after my non-compete was over. So, yeah, that's so far you're on the right track. Yeah.
And eventually then to the NFL Network.
Yeah. And I still do radio every day. So
you do still do radio every day.
Yeah. I maintained two jobs for the last 9 years. I do my NFL draft stuff for about 6 months a year. And then radio is a Monday through Friday, 7 a to 10 a job every day.
You've done writing, radio, and TV, podcasts. Do you have a preference of medium?
I enjoy radio. It allows me to be creative. You're off script more. And so, I kind of enjoy radio. I've done it for 26 years now. So it's probably the most enjoyable of the mediums, yeah.
It's odd, Lance. I cut the cable, the cord, as they say, last year. And so I have an LG TV. I love the picture, but not so much the operating system. So I hit the button and I said, NFL draft. And it took me to whatever LG's draft channel it was. It's just Daniel Jeremiah and crew, and that's what I watch. This year it automatically took me to your crew. Was it the first year that you've done that? I liked it a bunch. It was the three of you were really good, I thought.
Well, it's funny. So my first year was doing a 2015 draft. I came in the fall of 14, so I wrote all those prospects for the 15 draft. That was my first year doing it for NFL. And back then, we did we were just the shadow broadcast on NFL.com. So we did the entire 3 days of the combine, or 4 days of the combine. I was there for the draft. We did every draft pick for all 3 days, and we're in coat and tie and the whole 9 yards. So I did that in 15. I did just day 3 in 2016 in Chicago that year. 2017, I was in studio doing every pick again. And then I think I may have in 2018, 19 was a post-draft podcast. 20 was post-podcast through remote location. 21 was remote location. 22, I was out there, did post-draft podcast. And then this year was the first year we went back to doing draft coverage. That's because they're really promoting the digital platforms. Everyone's headed in that direction anyway. So we had good viewership. We had really good viewership on day 1 on YouTube TV, which is where you could find us. I'm not even sure day 2 and day 3 if I think it was YouTube, the NFL's YouTube channel. I guess that's probably where you saw it, because unless you're an NFL Plus subscriber, and even then, I think they had different programming on there. So, yeah, this is the first year that I've done it on on the digital platform in about 4 years where I talk about all the prospects, maybe 5 years.
Yeah, it was enjoyable. I liked it. I was glad I stumbled on it. Now, for you, you mentioned 6 months earlier, right? You're at about 500 prospects.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
I do about 500 a year. I've cut it down to like 478, 480 over the last 2 years. But anybody that I didn't write who gets drafted, I have to write after the process anyway, so that we have an official, scouting report on them. So this year I ended up at about 490 this year, somewhere in that neighborhood, 488. So pretty close to 500. Yeah.
I think you tweeted where you had to go back and maybe get a guy from Tennessee, Chattanooga.
I had to get 8 guys. Eight guys I missed this year. And I 2 years ago, I didn't miss any. But that was a COVID year. It's a little easier. This year, I looked at the guys I missed out on, and Dowell, the guy you're talking about, Dowling, something like that for Tennessee. Right. That's really the only guy. There was a punter from Wingate. There's no way I would have found him. But if you're a good tester, there were some prospects that there's just no way I would have found them this year. But I go look at pro day results, and I kind of know what teams are looking for sneaky prospects, and we had just 7 of them got past me because it was really no way I could have found those guys this year. Teams kind of kept them hidden, so I had to go back and write them this year. So yeah, it was, you think the draft's over, but it's not. My draft coverage still ended. I still had TV on Tuesday, TV on Wednesday. Had a compensatory pick article due on Thursday, and I had to have all my prospects written up on Monday that I didn't have previously. So my draft's officially over now.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
When you're working on those write-ups and you're watching the tape, what is it that you're trying to see? What is it that you're trying to glean out of it? And what are you using to then, what are you eventually trying to get to the viewer or the reader that they should know about each prospect?
Well, I go into each prospect assuming that the reader, there's a good chance they've never seen the prospect, because the reality is, even though a lot of us in the draft space, whether it's you're just a draftnik, somebody who follows it, somebody who writes on it, there's this assumption that we're in this bubble that everyone keeps track of the same storylines and narratives and prospects. But the reality is, a large percentage of people who read my draft prospects scouting reports already know that they've never seen these players. So what I have to do is I need to go in, find out who this player is physically, who he is athletically, who he is from a production standpoint. What are the areas where he thrives? What are the areas that can be corrected? What are the areas that are probably not correctable? And then I have to project who this player is going to be on the next level relative to understanding the pro game and how much growth is potentially going to be had for each prospect. And some of that you need to know what is coachable and what isn't coachable. And so when I write that prospect report, I want the viewer, or I want the reader to get, I want to paint a picture so that they get a feel for what it looks like when they're reading it. Just like if you write a chapter for a story or a book or an essay, you want to be descriptive enough that the person gets a feel for what they look like, how they play, what it looks like when they're moving, as receivers, as how strong they are, things like that. So I want you to feel like you know who this player is when you're done reading it, even if you've never seen him before.
When the process is over and the draft is done, do you self-scout? How do you go back and look at it and say, wow, I really had this guy much lower than the consensus, or maybe you were much higher on a guy? How do you sort of self-scout yourself when the process is done?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think really the self-scouting thing is I just want to know why a guy went. Okay, if a guy went earlier, I want to know why. What was it that other people see that I didn't see? Like, it could just be one team, But if I talk to different teams or different evaluators along the way, and they see a player different than I did, like Paris Johnson's an example. I see Paris Johnson. I've done a lot of offensive line stuff. I mean, I see Paris Johnson as a player in any other draft that my grade on him was a high second rounder. Now, tackles are always going to get pushed into the first if they're in that borderline. And this year there was not a great tackle class anyway. So I knew Paris would get pushed up the ratings. It wasn't a great draft class period in a general sense. Mm-hmm. But I want to see for some teams that really thought he was kind of quote unquote special, which I heard that from a couple teams. I'm curious why they see it, but I don't get too frazzled about that because I want to see how they play. I mean, ultimately, just because someone was drafted someplace that I didn't have them, well, let's let 2 or 3 years pass and see who ends up being right. What I usually go back and self-scout, Doug, is when I know I've missed on a guy based on how he plays in the pros. I want to know, all right, what was it that made him a better player than I expected him to be? That's what I want to know. And if I missed on him, why did I miss on him? And I might ask teams, was there injury stuff? Was there this, that, or the other? So it is important that you self-scout, though. Like, you need to know, well, I mean, you got to get better. We all have things. If you don't shoot threes, well, you need to be able to shoot threes. If you can't hit a fastball, you got to get in the cage and hit a fastball. For me, me taking reps is like, I got to know how the league is changing, or maybe what I have a bias for or against that may cause me to have inconsistencies from an evaluation standpoint. So, just being open-minded about it, being honest, not being afraid to miss and not being afraid to say you missed, that doesn't bother me. Missing doesn't bother me. I've written, over 4,600 scouting reports. And so I've got plenty of misses. That doesn't bother me, but it does bother me if I can't figure out how I missed on a guy. So I go back and do as much work as I can when I know I missed on somebody. I want to go see how I missed.
You mentioned tackle, Lance. I'm curious, when Wright goes off the board to Chicago, mm-hmm. I wonder if it also says something about where the state of the league is. More and more teams have premier pass rushers on both sides of the line. Is that right tackle spot, like a guy that plays right tackle, becoming more valuable as more teams load up on the defensive line?
Yeah, I think that, and you see sub packages now, so you have designated pass rushers that will come in as well. So yeah, you have to be able. I mean, first and foremost, I think the way it's really changed is pass rushing, pass protection takes on a greater amount of value for teams than run blocking does, and not just at left tackle. Now it's both tackle spots. It used to be, well, your right tackle can be your road grader. You can get them some help with a tight end, or you can chip on them. I mean, that's still true. But if you face a team that has really prioritized rush, you're going to face some problems on both sides. And so if you have a guy that doesn't have the foot quickness to meet speed rushers, it changes fundamentally what you can do on offense against certain teams. So how a player protects the passer now has become the top priority for most teams now. And then the run blocking takes on a different priority. It depends on the team, the running scheme, things like that. But some teams are willing to live with a little less run blocking. Some teams want your run blocking and pass protection to be similar. But pass protection now, whether it's left tackle or right tackle, it's just important. I mean, there's no way around it.
Lance, of the top 3 quarterbacks that got drafted, which, in your opinion, got put in the best position to succeed here? Sooner than later, I guess.
Oh, that's a really tough one because, if I strip every quarterback of who they are headed into this, and I just look at situation, I think potentially the Colts are the best situation. They've got a good running back. They've got an offensive line. They spent money in resources on offensive line. They've got defensive players they spent resources on. Shaq Leonard comes back. There's an offensive coordinator, a head coach who just got done working with Jalen Hurts, and maybe he can do the same thing with Anthony Richardson. So, and I think the Colts are going to be patient. So I actually think in a very sneaky way, maybe Richardson and the Colts is the best situation. But, if you want to look over the next 2 to 3 years, I think potentially the Texans with C.J. Stroud, because they're going to have money to spend in the offseason. You have D'Amico Ryans, who I think is going to be a good head coach for C.J. Stroud. You have the West Coast offense that kind of branches off of Kyle Shanahan's tree, Mike Shanahan's tree, Gary Kubiak, that whole family. And so Bobby Slowick, their offense coordinator, will run an offense that should be fairly quarterback friendly. It usually is from a read standpoint. The running game is usually better, which protects the passer as well. And I think that there's decent wide receiver prospects over with the Texans. Not great, but decent. Depends on what happens with John Mechie. Depends on how quickly Tank Dell gets integrated, and really, frankly, depends on if Nico Collins and Robert Woods can do their jobs this year. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say because you could make some. I don't think Levis is in a great spot, but it is what it is. There's, it's just Will Levis is in a situation that's going to be potentially a little bit tougher. I mean, on paper it might look good, but I don't think they'll have Derrick Henry much longer. So Bryce Young, I think, needs a little bit more. He needs more weapons. He doesn't have a Laramie Tunsil on the left side, so a little trickier. Then they lost Christian McCaffrey. The Texans just had a really good season with Dameon Pierce. So I'd say in the short term, Texans, C.J. Stroud. In the long term, probably Anthony Richardson, actually. Now, that's independent of how he plays, but the situation will be favorable.
You mentioned D'Amico Ryans, who I think was a great hire there. I'm curious, is it harder to have a defensive-minded head coach? I guess my thought being, like, if the offense is really good, then you're going to lose your offensive coordinator every year because more teams than less seem to go that route. Mm-hmm. Is that reasonable, or is that an odd take?
Well, no, I think it's reasonable. It's especially reasonable from offenses that are really good offenses, and everyone loves that tree that's really developed from Kyle Shanahan to Sean McVay and all the branches off those two trees. I think you've seen Kevin O'Connell, obviously. You've seen LaFleur. I mean, it's something that's definitely going on. We'll see if Brian Daboll starts to create that same thing, but he's going to be the play caller. Obviously, Shane Steichen from Philadelphia, and so when you have an offensive head coach who's also the play caller, like with Andy Reid, everyone's assuming the secret sauce is in the head coach, not the coordinator. That's the natural assumption that's made. When it's a defensive-minded head coach, everyone assumes it's got to be the offense coordinator. So I think that is one concern, is that you could lose your coordinator. So that could be difficult. That's why you have to insulate yourself with a good quarterback coach. If you have a good quarterback coach that gets close with the quarterback, the natural progression is for that guy to move on to offense coordinator. So adds a layer of continuity.
It's a Commanders podcast that I do, so we'll start moving in that direction. I want to start with this week on Twitter in Commander Land. The big thing has been player comps, right? Everybody is trying to get a player comp for Sam Howell. The broader question is it important to have player comps? Is it risky to have player comps? And what do we use them for? What is the best way we can use them as a tool?
I don't really think you can. I mean, for fans, what difference does it make who a player's comp to? I've seen some of I don't know where it started or how it started. I guess maybe something with Matt Miller.
Yeah.
I don't know.
He comped him to Colt McCoy.
Yeah, and I'm fine with the Colt McCoy comp. I comped him coming out to Chase Daniel because, frankly, his senior year was bad. I mean, it wasn't good. He was much better his junior year. But for me, I start my comps with the physical. Like, I start with physical similarities, height, weight. I like to look at playing style also. I don't get into comps. It's something I have to do. And sometimes, like if I could just have comps on guys that I feel comfortable doing comps on, that would be great, because there are times, that I really like comps. But I think for the first 2 to 3 rounds, if you feel like you have to do a comp, then a lot of times you're going to kind of reach. Like, sometimes you just don't feel comfortable. I mean, frankly, there's not a great comp for Bryce Young. It just there isn't one. It's really, really tough to find the physical comp to start with. And with Sam Howell, it's tough because the Sam Howell we saw in 2020 was much better than the Sam Howell we saw in 2021. So how much of your comp is based on the physical stuff, which is a lot for me. I start there. For some people, they look at comp and they think you're saying this is who the guy was, this is who the guy will be in the pros, when that's almost never what I'm doing. It's almost never what I'm doing. I usually look at who a guy was coming out of college, who a guy is now coming out of college. I like to get as close as I can to the physical dimensions and athletic dimensions, and then also who I feel like they were reminiscent of coming out of college. That's how I do it. What is there to learn from it? I think, so I asked teams about this. Some teams don't care about comps. Some teams do, because they feel like finding a comp can help them project the player. If they feel like, okay, they really remind me of this guy. The difference is NFL teams spend so much time on not just their rosters, but other teams' rosters, is they get I've noticed they have an incredible feel for players I never even thought of, that I completely forgot about. And then quarterback comps is an especially difficult one because you're only talking about a certain amount of players who, like, I'll give you an example. My comp for Pat Mahomes coming out was Jay Cutler. And everyone looks at that now like, what a terrible comp. I mean, when he was coming out, it really wasn't. Jay Cutler was kind of a wild child who had a huge arm, just like Pat Mahomes, would take a lot of chances, had a lot of home runs, but also had his own strikeouts, just like Pat Mahomes did coming out of Texas Tech, could make off-platform throws, could be creative. It wasn't meant as a slam at all. But when my comp came out, it was 2017. And then over the years, the perception of Jay Cutler goes down, and then Pat Mahomes goes up. And people don't understand when the comp came out what it was supposed to entail, what it was supposed to mean. It was supposed to be their playing styles, their physical attributes, things like that. So it's tough because people don't have context for what your comp is supposed to mean. Is it important? I personally don't think it's that important. I think if it reminds people of a certain player that a guy plays like, that's great. But a lot of times I think it's just stuff for people to get upset about when really I care about my evaluations. I really don't care about my comps at all, to be honest with you. It's not a big deal for me, but it is a big deal for some people, apparently.
For some people, apparently.
Yeah.
Last year, Ron, after drafting Dotson, had said, if we'd have gone back any further, we don't think he'd have been there. We didn't mind picking him 7 spots, let's say, early. It feels like they felt the same way about Forbes this year. Interesting that I've read a lot of people that had Forbes actually as cornerback 2. Where did Forbes sit to you? How do you think he fits in with the Commanders? And do you think it was an overreach there at 16?
Hard for me to say an overreach when you get a guy who has that kind of ball production. I mean, look, if you want to just talk about pure football, I think so I have to tell you, for my process, I learned a lot under Chris Ballard for about I've known him since 2004. Alonzo Highsmith, who's been in the league for years. Mm-hmm. My dad was an NFL coach, offensive line coach, but I've talked to a lot of coaches, a lot of personnel people over the years to learn my craft. And then since then, I talked to a lot of teams. I'm big into traits. So height, weight, speed, length, that typically, historically, you just find, while I love players and I tend to over obsess about players that are just really good on tape, the hard lesson you learn is that guys with certain measurables tend to have a much higher hit percentage than guys who fall under those measurable numbers. And so when I look at Emmanuel Forbes, I love the length. I love the ball production is phenomenal. The aggressiveness, everything about him. It's just he's 30 pounds lighter than Bryce Young. And we think of Bryce Young as this tiny, tiny guy. And Emmanuel Forbes, it's like it blows you away to think that you could lift him up so much easier than Bryce Young. He's 166 pounds, spindly legs. He's going to have to run support. So I dinged him for that. I knocked him down a whole grade from a 6'4" down to a 6'3", simply because the body type just typically doesn't make it in the NFL when you lack that. So for me, the problem was I think he's cornerback 2 on tape to Christian Gonzalez for me, and then Devon Witherspoon would probably be 3. But the problem with Forbes is that historically guys with that size and who are that lanky, they really struggle to stay healthy in terms of, if they have to do a whole lot of run support. But you don't figure that, you do figure that they'll be healthier just guarding, covering, some of the hitting, stuff like that. He did play in the SEC and stayed healthy. But from a football standpoint and taking the ball away standpoint, if you're okay with his size, with his weight and his frame, then I don't think 16 is an overreach because he's that good on tape. So you just have to be okay with the physical frame, and that's every team has to make their own decision there. If I were running a team, it would concern me. But if you're okay with it and you have whatever background that you have, or team philosophy, your team doctor, your sports science department says we're good on the frame and we give it a check, then you just say, then let's just study tape. Let's take a look at the tape. And the tape is going to speak very loudly for Forbes. That's a rare ball production.
Yeah, right. When they draft him, it's interesting because last year, it's Kendall Fuller outside, who really is only 28. It always surprises me when I see that he's only 28. And you got Benjamin St. Juice, who they drafted a couple years ago in I believe the third round. On the other, both of them last year they had Fuller inside. He can't play inside anymore, so they kicked him outside. So you've got these three outside guys that almost forced them to go nickel on the next one because they're in nickel almost 80% of the time. They come away with Quan Martin, but it was interesting. The pick before that is Brian Branch, who I kind of liked more. Did you have a preference of the two? Were you
Brian Branch.
Right.
Yeah, for sure, Brian Branch. I mean, Brian Branch can play nickel. He's not a pure nickel. I think from an athletic standpoint, Quan Martin's a better athlete, more explosive. He's faster. But, I mean, the better football player for me is Brian Branch. Brian Branch knows how to play. He's technically extremely sound. He can play a high safety role for you. He can play down in the box. I think he can line up anywhere you need him to. He's a very good tackler. He's very tough, and he's very smart. He's always in the right place at the right time. But this is one of those things where there will be some teams who say, we like Brian Branch a lot, but his ceiling's here, where Quan Martin, we like his tape here, but his ceiling's here because of his athletic attributes. That gets to the traits that we talked about. But for me, Brian Branch would be a very safe pick. I would have loved him at Washington with what they've got there because I think he is – I mean, what you're getting is a bunch of leaders on that defense and a bunch of guys who really know how to play, who come in with good technique and playmaking ability. And I think Branch would have been a great fit there. But Quan Martin has a high upside. I think he still needs to really lock in on playing a full-time nickel role.
They signed Nick Martin in the offseason from the Giants, or Gates, I guess. I've got my centers confused. At any rate, they made him the 15th highest paid center in the league, but then they draft Stromberg in the mid rounds there. Chance that Ricky starts year one, or in your mind, does he need a little bit more seasoning before he's a full-time starter?
Well, I think he needs a little more seasoning. I'm looking right now at your depth chart because, the other thing that you have to keep in mind is how many of these guys have center, guard, flex.
Mm-hmm.
There's one thing we've seen with a lot of centers coming out is a lot of centers coming out have turned into guards, whether it's full-time or part-time. So Norwell's a guard. Sam Cosme is a tackle turn guard, which I think you're going to sit tight there. But I think
real quick, were you surprised by that? I mean, 2 years in, they draft Cosme in the second round to play tackle, and they've given up on that experiment pretty quickly. Do you remember what you thought of Cosme? Was that one of those guys you expected would eventually have to kick into guard?
Here's exactly what I wrote. I'm pulling up the scouting report right now. I had a third round grade on him. I said, proportionally built left tackle with above average athleticism and solid technique, who has a tendency to play too mechanically and with inconsistent finish and fire. Getting out in space and adjusting to moving targets is a big plus, but he's unlikely to get bodies pushed around as a pure dry blocker, and he's not as instinctive as expected for a 3-year starter. His play strength looked improved this year in pass protection, and he works with quality posture and punch timing. Despite solid pass pro traits and good athleticism, he could find early trouble dealing with diverse attacks of NFL edge rushers. That's exactly what happened. And in conversations I had, I thought he did have the opportunity to move inside and play guard, because he had my comp on him was Connor Williams, who you may remember is his teammate at Texas, who went from left tackle down to guard and now is at center. So I saw a potential similar trajectory for Sam Cosme. So that doesn't surprise me a lot. I've got him as a very average average starter grade on him, and I think that's what he's becoming. But he's still got some work to do to get a second contract, obviously. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. As far as Gates, what is the long-term prognosis on Nick Gates' contract? Because I'll be honest with you, I'm a big fan of Stromberg's, and for you to draft Stromberg in the third round, I see it's a 3-year deal. Just looking at it as we go on Nick Gates, It's a 3-year deal. Looks like you're pretty much locked into it until after 2024, where you can get out of it. and you would end up saving a lot of money. You could get out of it in 2024 as well. But I think based on the number we see him at, I could see him just getting beat out and being a backup who can play, maybe some guard center backup if Stromberg outworks him, outplays him. I don't think it'll happen in 23, but it could happen obviously in 24. So that's something to keep your eyes on, because it should be best, let the best man win, as long as that contract number isn't too outrageous. And it's not going to be an outrageous cash number next year. For the cap number will be, I guess the cash AAV, average annual, is going to be 5.35 for Gates. So in 2024, so I could see Stromberg challenging by 2024, and I think Stromberg's going to be the better player, honestly.
Well, and you were sort of getting at this before I cut you off about Cosme, but sounds by all accounts from around the Commanders people that Norwell won't be on the roster this year. They'll let him go at some point. So maybe Stromberg at left guard to start.
Yeah, you could see that
because it's Chris Paul and Sadiq Charles behind.
Yeah, and I don't know if Sadiq. I mean, look, Nick Gates. I got to see if Nick Gates has what his background was in terms of playing guard. But I can tell you this. He's bigger than Stromberg, I believe. He's 6'5", about 312. Ricky comes into the league 6'3", 313. So my guess is you could see Nick Gates maybe play some guard and Ricky Stromberg play some center. Now they might flip it around, but it wouldn't shock me if what you're saying about Norwell not making the team, wouldn't shock me if they made this draft pick specifically to have Stromberg at center and move Gates to guard based on just size.
The other interesting thing, the Commanders fans are always complaining that they haven't upgraded the middle linebacker position. They drafted Jamin Davis some years ago. Didn't really work out there. They kicked him outside so he could be more reactive. Is the position itself just totally not valued anymore? Is that not just a Commanders problem, but is the league itself kind of moving away from that traditional middle linebacker?
Yeah, it's not valued until it stinks, and then it's really valued. Like, it's not valued until it is. And I can tell you this, when you don't have a capable inside linebacker, it's a problem. If you got a guy that's not instinctive, you've got a guy that can't take on blocks, that misses run fits, it's a huge problem, because you'll get gashed over and over, and you can't, it turns into an issue where you have to start moving safeties up. You have to start A-gap blitzing to try to dissuade teams from doing that. Honestly, Doug, I think inside linebacker, what's become diminished has been linebackers that can't play three downs. If you can play three downs, you still have value. Jack Campbell was not a special linebacker to me. I think he was overdrafted. I think Drew Sanders has a chance to be a really good NFL linebacker. And he's a guy that I think would have been a nice fit for Washington. I may have even plugged him in or thought about plugging him in one of my mock drafts to Washington at 16 in one of them because he can rush. He's got size. He can take on blocks. And he's got the speed to get sideline to sideline. So I think inside linebacker is one that, if you want to try to go cheap, there's positions like guard is one where teams have tried to go cheaper in the past. Obviously, running backs now have been devalued. Linebackers have, but a linebacker who can play all three downs and has some instincts in pass coverage and, is strong and fast. I mean, they're extremely valuable. So it's kind of funny. You're either really valuable or you drop down from a value standpoint. So it's kind of the middle class of middle linebackers, inside linebackers, has been greatly diminished.
Assuming that the new ownership group comes in, Harris and company, after the season's over, everybody's out, and they want to move to a more analytical style approach. I mean, at least that's what he's done with the 76ers. Are there GM head coach pairings that we should be looking at as Commanders fans that you see coming down the pipeline?
From an analytical standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I say that just because it feels like that's the direction Harris has gone in the past, at least with his other franchises. It doesn't have to, I guess, necessarily be analytical. I guess more than anything, I'm just curious your thoughts of up-and-coming young GM head coach pairings that you could see.
So
Like, I know a lot of people have the offensive coordinator from the Lions high up on the list of guys.
Yeah, Ben McDonald.
Riding, right.
Or Ben Johnson, rather. Is
Sure. But I guess more I'm thinking of GMs that are on the rise.
Well, Ian Cunningham from Chicago.
Okay.
So Ian Cunningham from Chicago is one name. Adam Peters. So Ian Cunningham was right-hand man for Ryan Poles, but he was already in Chicago, and Poles liked him so much he kept him there. I would say Adam Peters, who's the assistant GM with San Francisco. The question there is, and that's a heavily analytics-driven team too, or they pay attention to it. With Peters, the question is he going to be on the short list to join D'Amico Ryans if they get rid of Nick Caserio? And if not, does he want to stick it out and take over as GM when Lynch shuts it down over in San Francisco? So Adam Peters would be another one I would keep an eye on. Ed Dodds, who is less analytically driven, although the Colts do a lot of sports science and analytical stuff, and Ed's gotten on board with it a little bit more. Ed is an old school football guy who I think is really, really good. He's Chris Ballard's right-hand man over in Indianapolis. He spent a lot of time with John Schneider with Seattle. He's a name that has been interviewing a lot. Rex Hogan, who's the assistant GM with the New York Jets. Rex Hogan, the Jets are a very analytically and sports science inclined team as well, and Rex is very well connected around the league, knows a lot of the best up-and-coming coaches. So those are some names that I would keep an eye on as guys who could get hot depending on how their teams do. It's hard to become a hot prospect if your team doesn't perform well. But Ian Cunningham, I think from Chicago, no matter what happens, is going to be a hot prospect.
And I guess, Lance, let's wrap with this. I'm curious for the young listeners out there that are just getting started in the space, what would you advise them, suggest to them if they want to get into this kind of field that you're doing now?
I've been doing stuff like this. I started my own football company when I was 24, hustled my way into radio and had a morning drive time show by 27. And really the only way you can do it is by actually doing it. Like, just start doing things. Just create your own podcast, create your own YouTube channel, create a TikTok account, however you want to do it. But start watching a lot of games and start learning how to create content. You got to have an opinion, so you need to be like, it really depends, Doug, on what exactly it is they want to do. What I do is very, very time consuming, but all of us follow the same path. You got to learn about football, watch as much pro football as you can, learn what good starters, learn what average starters look like in pro football, because learn what a starter looks like. And then just start to incorporate information from my scouting reports, what Daniel Jeremiah says, Kuiper, McShay, Matt Miller, Jordan Reed, just anybody in the space. Go find your favorite guys on Twitter, on Twitch, on YouTube, TikTok, whatever it is, and start taking as many pieces as you can. And then there's a lot of websites you can read to go find evaluation or coaching stuff, to go find concepts. But just make yourself as football savvy as possible, whether it's X's and O's, whether it's the evaluating process, go watch a ton of football, and then just start working on creating content, because you don't get opportunities unless you put yourself out there, put your work out there, and go meet people and introduce yourself to people. That's really the only way it happens. So I'd suggest doing any and all of those things in your free time. It may not pay for a while, but if it's a labor of love, you got to keep doing it and keep doing it until you get to where you want to be, or you just keep loving what you're doing and you keep sharing your information with other people in the space and having a good time.
Lance, I really enjoyed this. I appreciate you so much sharing your time and your knowledge, and love to do it again sometime.
Appreciate it, Big Doug.